Good morning, everybody. In the past few weeks after the shooting death of Stephon Clark, there has been many questions, not just by the media, but also just by our community on what is the role of the District Attorney's Office in this process? What is our role in the review? There's also been questions after the Attorney General held a press conference on what is actually the role of the Attorney General in this particular case. So I wanted to have a press conference, really, because I wanted to talk about a few things. One of which is, what is the process for the DA's office? What is it going to be? How does that work? But I also think it's important that we talk about how do we move forward as a community in moving this community forward in this very difficult time, and how can we have meaningful conversations about reforms in our community as well as really in the criminal justice system. I would remind all of you that as a prosecutor, I don't talk about facts of cases that are pending. That's an oath that all of us take. So I will not answer any questions about specific facts on this case, and I will say this many times, we do not have this case in our office yet. Before I talk about the process, though, I want to say a few things just in general without knowing any facts other than what has been videos posted in the public. The reality is that what happened to Stephon Clark is a tragedy. I've watched the videos, at least the initial ones that were released. They're upsetting. I don't think anybody can deny that. The reality is that a human being was killed by the police. Many of you may or may not know this, but before I was even elected, I was in our homicide unit for many years. I've sat with families that have lost people, lost their loved ones. And for those folks, anybody that's lost their loved one to violence, the reality is that their world is never the same. They will never see the light of day the same. They will never have the same joy. And so I do understand, having come from being in that unit, that the lives of his family have been changed. I understand that. I also understand that there is a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and quite honestly, there's a lot of confusion in our community about what is happening. And so with that in mind, understanding all of that, I felt that, quite honestly, it was important that we address some things. First of all, I think it's important that people understand, the public, the media, what is the role of the District Attorney's Office in officer-involved shooting reviews. I think it's very important that people understand at the outset that there is no legal obligation for any district attorney across this state. There is no legal obligation for us to conduct these reviews. There's no legal obligation for the Attorney General to conduct these reviews. And in fact, before I came into office in 2015, our office had stopped legal reviews in 2011 because of the downturn of the economy. So that meant that from 2011 to 2015, when I had made a commitment we would in fact reinstate these, there was no legal reviews. And if the district attorneys, as a system is set up right now, if the district attorney does not do these reviews, no one does. That's the system we have now. Does that mean that the system can't be changed? Absolutely not, but that's the current system. But I also recognized before I was sworn in that this was an important job. This is an important conversation. This is an important process that we actually undertake to investigate independently and review these cases independently. Why? Because the community deserves that, because justice deserves that. Even though we don't have the obligation, we do that because that's what is right to do. And so within really 60 days of me coming in, our office developed a written protocol. We have an agreement with our law enforcement partners that we send investigators to the scene. We in fact do legal reviews. But we also have gone further than that to make sure that the community understands what is our rationale for any decisions made in these cases. So we post those on our website because we want folks to know and be able to look at that. We post frequently asked questions on what is the role of the DA in these cases. So before I kind of get into the specifics of an OIS, Officer Involved Shooting Review, I think it's important people understand, maybe you all understand it because you might cover courts or things like that, but not everyone understands, what does the DA do? What does our office do? What is our ethical obligations, whether it's on this kind of case or any kind of case? And I would remind people that the role of a prosecutor is to charge and prosecute cases only based upon the facts and the law. There's a jury instruction in California that's read to every jury in every county across the state in every case that goes to trial on a criminal case. One, you must decide the facts based only on the evidence presented. You must follow the law, whether you agree with it or not, and you must not be biased or pressured by public opinion. You must do your job. That is the exact same job we have as prosecutors. We are a county with a district attorney's office that reviews 35,000 cases a year. We make those decisions based upon the same way we make our decisions on officer-involved shooting cases, which is fair, independent, and just. When we have cases involving officer-involved shootings or in-custody deaths, we choose to conduct these reviews because the community has a right to a fair and independent and full review. And when we talk about those reviews, there are two questions very similar to any case that comes into this office for consideration of charges. Two questions. One, has a crime been committed? And two, if we believe a crime has been committed, can we prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt? The highest level burden of proof that we have in this country. It is not the standard for which we prosecute or have civil cases, beyond a reasonable doubt. So, when it comes to officer-involved shooting cases, it's very important the public understand that the role of the DA's office is not to provide or evaluate an opinion on whether the officers could have taken some other action, whether they made correct or incorrect tactical decisions, whether there are policies or procedures that the law enforcement agency could change or improve upon. Our role is a very fine, linear role, which is, was there a crime committed, and can we prove it beyond reasonable doubt? There is a body of case law that we are ethically bound to follow. If you want to look at any of our reviews, look at them online. You will see the body of case law that we are bound to follow. All of those things that often people have brought up, police policy practices, POBR, could they have done something different? Those are all very valid questions. They are something that are meaningful conversations and debates and moving forward. But the role of the DA's office is what I've said it is. So what is the process when an officer-involved shooting occurs? Under our protocol, the law enforcement agency immediately notifies our office. We have a team of district attorney investigators, peace officers, who are trained in these cases that immediately respond to that scene. In some cases, our crime lab, which is the district attorney's crime lab, goes to that scene and may respond and collect evidence if requested to do so. While the law enforcement agency of that jurisdiction conducts the investigation, our investigators have access to witness interviews, the shooting scene, evidence documentation, and collection. It's all done on an independent basis. Then the agency, for instance, in this case, the Sacramento Police Department, conducts their own investigation. Once that investigation is complete, it is sent to our office, it is sent to our Special Investigations Unit, and the review begins when the complete investigation is given to our office. Again, it's important to note that this case has not been received by the District Attorney's Office for review. It's also important to understand that in any case, particularly in a homicide case, there can be a multitude of different things that are submitted for review. I could probably spend a long time talking about different kinds of things. Every case is different. But there are many things that are going to be considered in any of these types of cases, potentially. Police reports, interviews, 911 tapes, body-worn cameras, in-car cameras, CSI reports, forensic evidence reports, toxicology reports, autopsy reports, crime scene reconstruction, photographs, diagrams. Those are just a snapshot of the types of things that can be submitted. There may be a need or a request by our office for additional investigation. That may occur on any of these types of cases. Again, once that case is fully submitted to us and reviewed, we base a decision on the facts and the law. We do not take these cases lightly, and in fact, on these particular types of cases, there is a multitude of layers of review by our office. As I mentioned, we have a special investigations unit. There is a deputy district attorney that's trained in these cases that reviews it. There's a supervisor that reviews it. There's an assistant chief deputy that reviews it. There's an assistant district attorney that reviews it. There's a chief deputy that reviews it. And then there's myself. There are reasons for those multiple layers of review. So, why in this particular case, why is the AG involved? And I'll say this off the bat, I have great respect for our Attorney General. And I was pleased to see that he did a press conference on this. As I've said all along, I have every ability and every bit of confidence that our office can and will do a full, fair, and independent case review of this case. But I also understand that there was a lot of anger, grief, frustration in our community in questioning the process. And so with that in mind, I had no problem with the Attorney General coming in this case. Again, there's going to be two different independent investigations. There's been a lot of questions asked. Well, what does that mean? Is the AG going first? Is he going after you? Are you going to decide things together? Are you going to talk to each other? Well, the reality is that they're doing their own, not just an investigation, because I think it's been lost in some of the conversations, is it's not just that they're embedding investigators into the police department's investigation. They are doing their own legal review, independent of our office's legal review. So the question has often come up is, well, what does it mean? Are they going to issue their review first? Is the DA going to go first? Honestly, I can't tell you the answer to that question, because that's the purpose of an independent review. He may go first, he may not go first. I don't know the answer. I say the same thing. He doesn't have the case as well. I cannot tell you when the Attorney General will make a decision. I cannot tell you when this office will make a decision. So then the second thing that I mentioned at the beginning was not only the importance of talking about the process and what our obligation is as the DA's office is, how do we as a community move forward? Because anybody that has watched what's occurred in Sacramento, California, whether it be here locally or nationally, must acknowledge that the Stephon Clark case and the issues we face transcend this case. We must acknowledge that we have bigger things. This is very big, but there are more things that we need to talk about. And that's what I think is important, that we have conversations about that. We must be willing, not just as elected officials or law enforcement leaders, but we must be willing as a community to have meaningful conversations, dialogues, debates, and ultimately decisions on how do we move forward. Can Sacramento County, the city of Sacramento, the county of Sacramento, can we be a model for moving forward? And in my opinion, the answer is clear, absolutely. But that means that we must work together as a community. we have to be willing to developing this model, that we have to be willing to acknowledge, as I have said for long periods of time, that there is an opportunity gap. There is an opportunity gap in our community. We must acknowledge that. 2 weeks ago, I sat at City Council meeting. I sat there and I listened, and I heard people say, I heard it in anger, I heard it in grief, and I heard the words like poverty, economic disparity, education, housing. All of those were raised because those are valid points. We have to be willing to acknowledge that opportunity gap as a community. As a DA's office, oftentimes people say, what are you doing? What are you doing to help us with that gap? Most people think a DA's office is just typically reactionary. The police arrest somebody, they send the case to us, we decide if we're going to prosecute, we go to court and we prosecute them. But for a long period of time now, I've had the opinion, and this office has moved in the direction that we have a greater obligation to help close that opportunity gap. Because if we can, in fact, help narrow that gap, that those opportunities are greater for individuals, that they're going to have a healthier, happier, more successful life, and ultimately, we're going to be a safer community. So when we have things in our office that are non-traditional, like a partnership with reading partners, or going into schools to try to get kids back in school, or having youth academies, those are because that's what's right to do for this community and to move us forward. Does that mean there's not more that we can do? Of course not. There's always going to be more. But there's packets that we have because it's important that people understand what we do as an office as well as individually to help us narrow that gap. But that's where we must work together, not just as a DA's office, but law enforcement, elected officials, community-based organizations, and really our community at large. I have no doubt that out of this tragedy there will be movement in that direction. But there's other things that we should talk about that this case transcends, because there's been many a discussion. Police shooting reforms. Can there be reforms in our system on that? I would remind you that as the system is currently set up, if the DA doesn't do it, there's no obligation for anybody else to do that. Does that mean that we can't change the system? No, not at all. In fact, I've had many discussions, not just around this shooting, but long before this, on how can we set a system up? Because people want to trust whatever the outcome is. And so I've had conversations with elected officials, Mayor Steinberg, the Attorney General, law enforcement chiefs, community-based organizations, and there's two things that everybody agrees on, no matter who does it. One, the community wants trust, and two, they want a full, fair, and independent review. That's what the community deserves. So does that mean that we can't develop a system that achieves that goal? Of course not. I have and am willing to be part of that conversation. And I have no doubt that this conversation, which had started long before the Stephon Clark shooting, will continue and that changes will be made. And then lastly, I just think it's important that when we talk about moving our community, not just our community, but our system, as I would say, forward, we have to have meaningful conversations about fair, balanced, and meaningful criminal justice reforms. Whether it's police shootings, whether it's sentencing reforms. People may not know this or realize, but I've been advocating for sentencing reform for a few years, and in fact have had folks introduce legislation, very significant sentencing reforms that will bring balance and justice to our system. So those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about as a community that we must move forward. So to just end on this note, there's two reasons why I felt that it was important to do this. One, to demonstrate our commitment to a full, fair, and independent review. And two, to demonstrate our commitment to moving our community forward even in the most difficult times. because I'm confident that we will in a positive way. So with that, anybody have questions?
In the case
and remember, don't ask any facts about the case. I cannot answer that, Bob. You know that.
In the case of the Joseph Mann shooting, where cell phone video showed Mr. Mann standing on the sidewalk and the officers who were kind of late to the party arriving and shooting him to death. The community, I think it's fair to say, most people in the community thought that was an unjustifiable shoot. That was not prosecuted.
Right.
How much, can you explain here to us why that was not an unjustifiable shoot, or why that did not result in charges, and how much do you think that shooting brought us to the lack of trust that we now have between the community?
Well, first of all, I think, I'm not going to talk about the facts of the case because it was fully reviewed and it's on our website, so you can look at that again. But I mean, do I understand people's frustration? Absolutely. Again, I'm going to say the same thing. We're going to follow the facts of the law, even if we disagree with them. So I'm not going to answer any questions about Mr. Mann's case because that case is done and we've done our review on that.
I know you've done the review, but you've never explained it publicly. You've never explained.
That's the point of the review. It's published online. So, as I said, there's a body of law that we follow, and it was reviewed, as I said, by multiple layers, and that's my explanation for it. And I understand that's frustrating to folks. It doesn't. I mean, I understand that, but that's my answer. So, yes, sir.
One of the things that's brought protesters to your office 3 days a week and all over the streets of downtown is the fact that within days, a private autopsy was released showing what allegedly happened to Stephon Clark. Why can't you ask the coroner to at least release a preliminary autopsy from the county showing what kind of wounds he sustained?
I don't control the coroner's office.
Well, they blame you for the delay. I mean, they say that it all has to be reviewed by the district attorney before they release the autopsy.
I'm not sure about that part. I haven't heard that, but I do know that they have their own department head and they do their own reviews. That's part of the process. The coroner's report is one piece, including the other autopsy, which I'm sure will be considered, but that's all part of the process. So, but that's only part of the case. We have to get all of the case. I understand the autopsy is an important part of this, but autopsies in homicide cases oftentimes take time. There may be additional things they're asking for as follow-up. I don't know the answer to that. So, yes, sir.
So your office hasn't prosecuted any use of force cases, correct me if I'm wrong. Now, you said there's a dual standard. Has a crime been committed, and can we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt?
Right.
Have you ever answered yes to the first question and no to the second?
On officer-involved shootings, I'd have to look at I think we have about 26 reports online. I have to look at them specifically. I mean, the answer is obviously clear that we have not prosecuted any use of force cases based upon our reviews.
And no 2017 reviews have been released yet?
No, not that I've seen. Not that I've seen. I will say, because a lot of questions have been asked of me and others, you know, how long is this process going to take? And that's a difficult question. I can tell you the average time, typical, on these types of cases can be 6 months to over a year. If you look, it may be frustrating, and I understand that. If you look to other DA's offices, it can be the same. It can be upwards of 2 years. It depends on the facts and circumstances. So I understand the concern and the pressure from the public, but we're going to do our process.
Should people have a problem with the perception of the police union contributions to you 2 days after the Clark shooting? I mean, have you thought about giving that money back?
Well, let me say it this way, because I'm not going to talk about the campaign. What I will say is that long before the shooting, a month or so before, I actually asked the Attorney General for an opinion. We're allowed to ask for legal opinions on two questions. One, in an election cycle, is it a conflict of interest to do an officer-involved shooting review where you have received donations from a police union group? And two, even if it's not a legal conflict, would you, the Attorney General, take these cases to avoid the appearance of a conflict? And so, a month or so before this incident even occurred, the answer to those questions was no. And so, that's my answer. As to the campaign, I'm willing to answer outside of this office, but I'm not going to talk about the campaign here. Yes, sir.
Based on what you just told us, do you feel that protesters are unfairly targeting your office and expressing their frustrations with law enforcement?
I wouldn't say unfairly. I mean, I think there's frustration. We have to acknowledge that. That's why I think this press conference is important to explain the process. So, I mean, I'm not going to deny there's frustration, anger, and rage. We see it every day right now, out in front of our building, behind our building. But I'm going to, you know, the fact of the matter is we're going to follow our process. And the protesters are not going to stop us from following that process.
Are there a couple of things that you might be hearing right outside of your office from protesters in which you feel maybe they get it wrong and bring it to your doorstep? Specific things that you hear.
Well, there's clearly frustration and anger towards police. I mean, we can't deny that. We hear it. Our staff hears it. Our victims and witnesses that are just trying to come in and out of the building hear it. So I'm not sure if I want to say it's misdirected. I think there's anger and frustration not just about this situation and this shooting, but there's anger and frustration about all these other things, and I understand that. That's why I feel like it's important that we talk about it. But that's, I mean, I'm not sure how else I can answer that question.
If you could deliver a message to the protesters, what would you tell them?
The protesters, I respect peaceful protests. I do respect that. I think what's happening and what's happened in the last week is anything but peaceful. I mean, if you were to see video footage or just see what's happening behind our building, when people are simply trying to leave to go home, whether it be to pick up their children or get to wherever they need to go, and their cars are being surrounded and they're being screamed at and cussed at and blocked, having their license plates filmed, or when a victim or a witness is afraid to come into this building because they're screaming, I think that's not peaceful. And again, I respect peaceful protests, but when you engage in that behavior, that's not peaceful.
Can you talk about, you said that you have your own independent team that goes out on these officer-involved shootings. The police department does their own investigation.
Right.
How much of their investigation figures into your review process, and how much do you lean on your own independent team?
Well, we rely on the law enforcement agency to do the investigation. We have our own independent team that can go there, ask for follow-up, do those kinds of things. If we need follow-up once it's been submitted by the police agency, our investigators will do that. We may ask the law enforcement agency to do it, but our investigators have the authority to do that as well. So I don't want, I think it's important to note that the primary investigative agency under this agreement is the agency that's involved, so in this case, SACPD. But we have that level of review for our own investigators as well.
Should that be the case? Should they be investigating themselves in other states? Well, Oklahoma, for instance, the OSBI comes in, they investigate officer-involved shootings.
I think that's a valid question. I think that's a valid question. Do I think they're capable of investigating their own? Yes, I do. But I also understand that there's the question of community trust. So conversations that I've had with our chiefs or with other elected DAs is different ideas about how can we achieve that goal of that full, fair, and independent review or investigation with a model that works practically. Because there has been the suggestion, whether it's by Kevin McCarty or others, is why don't we just create an agency that can do all this? Well, that may be a valid thing. The question is that practical? How do you set up a system? And I think the Attorney General will tell you that's a very difficult system to set up because of the, how many lawyers would you need to do statewide reviews? How many investigators would you need? How do you get statewide investigators that if they're housed or housed here in Sacramento to go down to a shooting down in Southern California? Homicide scenes are active scenes, so how do you do that? So there's practical things. I think we're all willing to work towards how do we achieve that goal, though. And so the ideas have been brought up. How about a regional team here in Sacramento? You know, if SACPD does the shooting, can other investigators from other law enforcement agencies do that investigation? Same could be the argument for a DA's office. Can we have a system set up where, the local DA doesn't do that review? The most important thing of all of it is, from my opinion, is it just needs to be full, fair, and independent, because that's what demands community trust.
In the future, would you please move over towards the middle of the podium so you're kind of in the middle of the microphones? In the future, would you consider having events like this to explain after the determination has been made in an officer-involved shooting case?
I think we consider that, yeah.
And
I know some DAs do it, others don't.
You keep referring us to the website, but I'm looking at the website right now when I looked up the man shooting, and it's page not found.
Well, you're looking at the wrong page, Bob, because it's there. I looked at it this morning.
All right. So, I mean, but is it enough to just refer people to the website, or should the district attorney come forward and explain to people why, in a case like Joseph Mann, why that is a justifiable shoot?
Well, I'm telling you right now, it's on the website, so, because I looked at it this morning.
Okay.
So we can send you the link for it, but I think it's a valid point that we can have conversations about whether or not, when cases are reviewed and released, that we have those conversations.
As part of the evidence, will you consider the independent autopsy from the family of Stephon Clark?
I'm confident we will.
Okay, so not just the county's autopsy?
I mean, as prosecutors, we consider all evidence, all relevant evidence, and I'm confident that we're going to consider that as well.
Emery,
And I haven't seen it, just so you know.
so when you do a review, you look at the two legal questions.
Yes.
And you don't comment on tactics and things of that nature. Is your office legally barred from commenting on tactics and
I wouldn't say we're barred from it. I think that that's not the practice of really, I'm not sure I've seen it at any DA's offices. What I think is probably helpful in this case is that the Attorney General has said he will do that because, you know, I'm not a police officer, okay? I'm not the person that goes through the training and all that kind of stuff. I don't develop the policies for the police department. Does that mean that we don't necessarily have an opinion or don't want to have an opinion? No, but whatever I tell a police chief or a sheriff is advice. Doesn't mean that they have to take it or not. So I think that having the AG in this case to help develop those best practices is helpful. But I think that we're going to continue as a community, as a county, with our various law enforcement partners having those conversations.
How would you describe communication with leaders of some of these protests? They say it's nearly impossible to have a sit down with people.
I'm not sure they've ever asked. If they'd like to sit down and have a meaningful conversation, I would.
So your office reviews the investigation that the law enforcement agencies do themselves.
Yes.
Can you give us an example where you've asked for more information in a use of force case?
No, I can't give you that, but we can. I'd
Has
have to
there-
ask.
do you
I would
know
have
if
to
there
ask
has
our
been
assistant. Pardon me?
Do you know if there has been an instance where you guys have requested more information?
I'm confident there has, but I can't give you the specifics. I mean, I'd have to look at all the reports, and I'd have to go back to the team of special investigations and ask them if they've done that. I mean, there's always different, whether it could be, you know, we have a crime lab. We may ask for certain pieces of evidence to be analyzed in a given case. It could be, we want more testing done on whatever, blood sample, whatever. I can't answer that. And I'm sure that's happened.
Does you take the police department's investigation, you review it, you do your own investigation. Does your own investigation include interviewing the two officers?
No.
Why
we do
not?
They're present. Because they're conducted by the police department and we're present for those investigations.
It wouldn't help for your office to have their own interview?
I think if there's additional things we would need for the purposes of the criminal review, we could do that.
Have you
But
done
we
it
were,
before?
pardon me?
Have you ever done it?
Oh, I'd have to look back into the cases. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, some of it, I mean, you have to look at the legal reviews online, but we rely on the police agency provided with us. We have the right, and we do have investigators present during the interviews. And if we need additional information to make a decision, we can ask for that.
You said 6 months to a year when you actually start the review process.
And I just want to make sure that's a very fluid number.
Yeah. Before that, do you have a timeline of when you expect to get this case in your hands?
I can only kind of give you anecdotal information, which is, I think, in our county, it can take upwards of 3 months or so, but I can't tell you on every case. In other counties, it might take 6 months for the police agency to give us the case. Our protocol essentially says in writing that once they've completed their investigation, we expect that case within 30 days to be sent to us. Then we start our review.
And is that 3 months that you just mentioned, is that with OISs or just in
Oh, no, that's OISs. That's every case is different. So homicide cases oftentimes can take a long period of time.
So it can take another 3 months from now to receive? Possibly.
What's your name, by the way?
Lamore Abrams.
Lamore, I can't answer. I don't know the answer of how long it'll take them because we're not, you know, we don't have the case. So I don't know. That's a question you should ask the police department of how long do you expect the investigation to take to be completed.
Same question on the autopsy and the ETA, when your office would get them?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would imagine that I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. That's up to the coroner's office. I do know in homicide cases, you know, even when I was in the homicide unit, sometimes it takes upwards of 6 to 8 months to get an autopsy. Now, I can't say that's going to happen in this case. I don't know. But that's not uncommon.
Just to clarify, Anne, you said that your people sit in on the police department's interviews with the officers who did the shooting, right? Has that happened? Have they interviewed them?
I don't know. Michael, can you answer that question? Lizina?
They usually monitor the interview from another room.
It hasn't been done.
And do they ask their own questions?
If they need to, and if they want to.
can't submit questions to be asked.
But has it been done?
My understanding at this point is that
It has?
that's my understanding.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that because I don't know the facts again, but.
We don't have the report, so I can't answer that.
But, I mean, you've had people monitoring it, so you know, right?
I haven't seen those reports yet.
Was there anybody in the room who was part of that monitoring who could tell
No.
us?
We can find out.
No, and I think it's, and I mean, I said this before, and I know people want to know facts, but we're not going to, you know, our obligation is not to talk about facts on a pending case. So I respect the public's right, or interest in knowing, but we're just going to stick with what our job is.
Have you reached out to Second Clark's family?
I have not.
Why not?
The case is not in our office. We have not started a review, I believe, just based upon other information that the police department has.
When you look at use of force cases and the idea of whether criminal charges are warranted, especially in fatal officer shootings, do you only look at murder, or do you look at a whole panoply of charges, you know, reckless firearm discharge, assault with a deadly
Right.
weapon, in the Joseph Mann case with a car? Do you look at
We look at what was a crime committed, and there could be homicide, it could be something lesser than the homicide, so any potential charges that could arise. And then the second question, is it proven beyond a reasonable, can it be proven beyond a reasonable doubt? Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much.